Hi, Gavin. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'm looking forward to exploring cultural landscapes and policies.
Growing up in a very small town, about 600 people, Shore Acres. It was intimately connected to the water, and almost everyone in the town was in some form or fashion. We were on, near, or in the water as much as possible, and so there was a deep place attachment to that landscape. And one of the things that was, in some cases, most troubling is that when that town was initially settled in the 30s, and our house was built, one of the first houses built in the area, or the house where our house sits was approximately 8 feet higher than it is today, due to large-scale groundwater extraction by the growing petrochemical industry and the growing Houston metropolitan area. And so with large-scale groundwater extraction, the property and much of Shore Acres sank due to subsidence 6 to 8 feet.
Wow.
And that dramatically impacted the vulnerability of the community. And so after graduation, worked in state government and worked with many communities, acquiring and relocating flood-prone properties and communities. And that also got me thinking about cultural landscapes, because the acquisition or the buyout of hazard-prone communities, it's not just a fiscal transaction. It's not just the idea of the home is being bought, it's being torn down. And what I observed repeatedly is that people, of course, are closely tied to where they live, and they're often closely tied to their communities, which is also brings us back to cultural landscapes. And it is incredibly poignant to see someone and talk to someone about it, and then actually seeing their houses and their communities torn down. I've seen it quite often. Very moving in many ways, because people are observing the loss of a physical structure, but they're seeing, the change, a fundamental change in their community and their community and sense of play. And so, given that we are part of the landscape, and that we modify it through good actions or at our peril when we make bad choices. The connection between culture and environment, I think, is really important for us to think through, and also to think about how landscapes connect us, whether it's cultural and environmental. They're not separate; they're intertwined. And as practicing professionals, whether we're landscape architects, land use planners, public policy people, I think there's a lot of lessons to continue to unpack. And one of them is to make sure that we understand that the environment and culture are intimately connected, and it's up to us to recognize that and develop policies that recognize that as well. All of my conversations will bring us back to, or connect us to, resilience. And the idea of since the beginning of time, when humans settled in areas that were prone to hazards, focus on the coast perhaps, or even riverine communities, they did it for a reason. They did it because of transportation, or ultimately economies, or the fishing was good and there was plentiful food and so forth. And so there's a reason why communities have chosen to settle in areas that are prone to hazards. But at the time, as we settled and created permanent human settlements that were affixed to an area, that might be highly dynamic, whether it's a barrier island community or a riverine community, it became more difficult to adapt in some ways. And I think that's one of the real pressing questions is, a lot of our human settlements have been built in a way that and designed in a way that reflects the climate of the past. And so bringing us now into this notion of resilience and climate change, the idea of protecting these cultural landscapes, while really important, we've got to make some big choices about who pays for it. What do we design those protective measures to? How do we take into account issues of equity? And if you just look at places like New Orleans that are a cultural icon, how much do we invest? Do we create protective measures that protect against the 100-year flood as we know it today? I think that's short-sighted, but that's what we're doing. And so, we've got some really big questions to think through on this front. talk about more intense rainfall in areas, whether it's riverine or not. And we've got these what are called now being called no-name storms. They're not tied to hurricanes or coastal storms, but rather large amounts of rainfall in communities that haven't seen flooding like this since recorded history. Mm-hmm. We've also got extreme heat in a threat that many of us don't recognize. That's the greatest killer of people around the world. And yet we have communities throughout Europe and throughout North America and elsewhere that, again, have been designed to reflect a different climate. We as a nation, if we're focusing on the U.S., are trying to move in that space. And I would suggest that all of the racial strife that's kind of bubbled up in the last couple of years, it's been underlying in this nation since its founding, of course, but it's gotten much more attention. And I think issues of equity are starting to rise, and with the Biden administration certainly looking to push that more so than the former administration. But I would dare say that the narrative versus the operationalization of policy in practice is still lagging. Mm-hmm. If you were to look at different FEMA programs, they certainly seek to do that. Mm-hmm. But then when you analyze a lot of the programs, and you could return to buyouts, there's a lot of questions surrounding buyouts and the degree to which they actually account for equity. A few examples. One is the fact that buyouts are pre-disaster fair market value. That's a middle and upper income mindset, frankly. On the face of it, for many of us, we would say, well, that's amazing. They would buy our house at its pre-disaster fair market value because it's valuable. I mean, that's our primary. That's where the basis of our equity, is in our houses. But if you're poor and your house is worth $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 and it's in bad condition, to take that money and to try to find a decent, affordable, energy efficient home that's in good condition outside the floodplain in many places throughout America, it will be very difficult. So that's just one example of many policies at the federal level. Another that comes to mind is the idea that much of post-disaster aid is intended to help homeowners. Mm-hmm. Well, that's great if you're a homeowner, but if you're a renter, you often are struggling to figure out a way to recover financially, which is often one of the greatest challenges facing the poor, is they don't have the assets, the savings that allow them to bounce back, but rather if their home, while modest, is a rental unit, but everything they own is in that unit, and they have a part-time job or they're just getting by, what we find is many people never recover to their pre-event condition after a major disaster. Never. In the rest of their life, they never recover. Well, I think one of the really important issues that sometimes we lose sight of, and you could almost argue I was guilty of just what I'm about to say, is that I talked about FEMA, the federal government. But in reality, we need to think about this as a governance issue. It's broader than the federal government. It requires state partnerships, nonprofits, foundations, corporations, individuals, and so forth, community groups to work together. And that's often challenging because of the lack of pre-event planning for these eventualities. But what I'll say is, for example, and just thinking about the North Carolina case, is after Hurricanes Fran and Floyd, particularly Floyd, the governor recognized that, this issue of buying out homes at their pre-disaster fair market value was not adequate for the nature of the people that were bought out. And so the state developed a program, the State Acquisition Relocation Fund, where they put up to $75,000 of state money on top of the federal buyout money. Mm-hmm. So in many cases, the state money was larger than the federal pot. Mm-hmm. And so in essence, the homeowner that had a $20,000 house, which, believe it or not, there were houses that were being bought out at $20,000. $5,000 on top of it, $95,000 in Eastern North Carolina, you can get a nice house outside the floodplain. And but that's a one-off. That's an example of federal state partnerships. In other cases, nonprofits are filling the void where they're looking to repair or rebuild or even elevate low-income housing. But really my point is that we haven't done a good job nationwide of thinking through these broader governance issues through good collaborative planning, including making sure that the plans include those that are often marginalized and that have been disempowered or have never had access to power or influence in decision-making. And all that said is communities often try to do this in the aftermath of a disaster, which makes it that much harder because many people are hurting, including governmental officials oftentimes. But the challenge is to make planning salient before the storm, before the flood, earthquake, wildfire, landslide, or what have you. That's one of the grand challenges is how do we do that? And that brings us back to governance, which is the federal government and state government and others should be providing additional money and or technical assistance and capacity building efforts to incentivize, encourage, and to demonstrate the value of planning for these eventualities. That's a great question. And so this goes back to the idea of good pre-event planning can help us identify gaps in the system. And for example, gaps in the system are, what if you have a fairly large rental population? Or what if you have a historic community that is maybe they're struggling financially? So how do we incentivize the community to say, in order to protect and preserve our cultural landscape, which is one of the most valued aspects of our community, there may not be a monetary amount set on that, but that's what's important to the community, which brings us back to planning. Good planning ought to be driven by community goals and aspirations, and it should be a means to link those goals and aspirations to resources, whether it's money or technical assistance, or even providing the basis to say, wait a minute, we need changes in policy at the state or national level to place greater emphasis on protecting these landscapes. And this is yet another challenge, is that a lot of post-disaster and pre-disaster aid is predicated on the value of a structure, monetary value. It doesn't always account for environmental benefits or cultural benefits when you're doing things like benefit cost analysis or trying to determine assistance. It's often driven by this notion of cost effectiveness, which again is really tied to the idea of doing benefit cost analysis. And if you don't capture and it's hard, it can be done, and economists have done it repeatedly. They've monetized environmental benefits and they've monetized cultural benefits. But I would argue that our policy framework is still lagging in that regard. Of interdisciplinary collaboration, or I've talked a lot about collaboration and governance. If we're thinking about it relative to the university setting, or just the broader setting in general, the need for physical scientists, social scientists, designers, land use planners, engineers, developers, you name it, social justice advocates, which brings, this challenge requires interdisciplinary thinking. And in fact, I would argue that a lot of the problems that our nation and the world is facing is because we often, in the case of resilience and adaptation, we are sometimes guilty of trying to come up with a unidimensional answer. And if we go all the way back to the beginning and the notion of resilience, what is resilience? Well, resilience, one of the strength of resilience and its roots in ecology are about diversity. Not a unidimensional force against another opposing force, but rather when we talk about risk reduction, we often talk about multiple lines of defense. Or when we're talking about good institutional resilience, we're talking about governance. We're not talking about just the federal government, or we're not just talking about a levy. We're talking about green infrastructure. We're talking about selective, perhaps if necessary, relocation. We're talking about good land use planning. We're talking about good utilization and management of our landscapes, but not one in isolation. And so in order to become a truly resilient and adaptive community or region or nation or globe, we've got to be thinking about this as a as an interdisciplinary problem, but also one that we need to tackle at multiple scales, everything from the individual sites all the way up to, thinking about the global implications of how we interact with other nations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what a call to action.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you so much. This has been such a great opportunity to learn, and I appreciate your time.